This is Force Command. We surrender.
The signal came in at 3:47 station time, buried under 40 years of cosmic static, and the first thing Commander Naomi Reyes felt was not fear, it was recognition. A human voice, calm and measured, reciting the formal opening cadence of a fleet command transmission, the same cadence drilled into every officer who had ever stood a watch. Then the words themselves arrived and her hands went still over the console. This is Fleet Command broadcasting on all frequencies. Effective this hour, the forces of Earth and her colonies lay down arms. We surrender. She sat alone in the signals bay of Kestrel Station, a listening post tucked into the cold dark past the vantage line, and she listened to that sentence 4 more times before she trusted herself to move, because there was no surrender. There had never been a surrender. Every schoolchild in the colonies could recite the outcome of the Vantage War from memory. Humanity held the line. Humanity did not kneel. The war ended in silence, not submission, when the enemy fleet simply turned and left, and no one still living entirely understood why. Naomi pulled the waveform up on the main display and stared at it the way she might stare at a face she recognized in a crowd that should not have existed. The voice print was clean, unmistakably human, unmistakably male, unmistakably recorded using Fleet Standard vocal encryption from the era of the Vantage War itself. And according to every archive she had clearance to touch, it had never been sent. Not by any vessel in the historical record. Not by any authority that had ever existed. She had grown up on the story of that war the way most people her age had, in fragments handed down by people who wanted to forget it and couldn't quite manage. Her grandmother used to talk about the year the sky went quiet, the year every household with someone in the fleet stopped sleeping through the night, the year hope had become a ration thing, doled out in small, careful amounts because there was no telling when the supply might run out entirely. The Vantage War had lasted 6 years, had cost more lives than any conflict in human history before or since, and had ended not with a treaty, not with a parade, but with an enemy fleet that simply reversed course 11 days before the projected fall of the outer colonies and never came back. No one alive had ever fully explained why. It was the great unanswered question at the center of an entire generation's mythology, the one loose thread historians had tugged at for half a century without ever managing to unravel it. Now she was staring at a thread with a name attached, and the name belonged to a dead man. She ran the voice print match a second time, this time against the deep archive rather than the public one, and the result came back identical, down to a 99.8% confidence interval that left almost no room for coincidence or forgery. Someone had either found a way to perfectly replicate a 58-year-old cipher using equipment that no longer existed, or the recording was exactly what it claimed to be, and the second possibility frightened her considerably more than the first. She flagged the signal as anomalous, logged the timestamp, and did the thing that separated a good analyst from a merely competent one. She did not close the file. She kept listening all the way to the end, where the voice gave a set of coordinates that matched nothing in any current star chart, and then, almost as an afterthought, spoke a name that made the hair on her arms rise. This is Admiral Elias Marsh, Task Force Ember, signing off. Task Force Ember had been destroyed with all hands 58 years ago in the last true engagement of the Vantage War, in a system so far past the frontier that no rescue mission had ever reached it. There were no survivors. There were no records of any surrender order. There was only a name on a wall at the Vantage Memorial, 3rd row from the top, and a story every recruit was told about the fleet that vanished holding the line so Earth never had to. Naomi sat with that contradiction for a long time before she reached for the comm. She did not sleep that night, not because the signal frightened her, though some part of it did, but because she recognized with the particular clarity that comes at 3 in the morning that she had just been handed one of 2 possible futures. Either she had found evidence of history's most consequential forgery, or she had found evidence that history itself had been quietly, deliberately incomplete for 58 years. And either way, the rest of her career was very likely about to be defined by what she chose to do with the next 48 hours. She had joined the Signals Corps 12 years earlier for reasons she rarely explained to anyone, reasons that had less to do with duty and more to do with a childhood spent listening to her grandmother's stories and wanting, quietly and stubbornly, to be the kind of person who paid attention when everyone else assumed there was nothing left to hear. She thought of her grandmother now, gone 8 years, and wondered what the old woman would have made of a voice from the deepest part of that terrible silence finally choosing to speak. By morning, she had done what any careful officer does with something too strange to be an error and too precise to be a hoax. She built a case instead of an alarm. She cross-referenced the vocal signature against 3 separate archives, all of which confirmed the same impossible thing. This was Marsh's voice, encoded with cipher protocols that had been retired and physically destroyed after the war, protocols no forger in the last half-century could plausibly reconstruct. She traced the transmission's point of origin as best the drift allowed, and the vector pointed away from any inhabited system, out past the edge of the charted frontier, toward a binary system flagged on old survey maps simply as the Cygnus Threshold. She knew the name. Everyone who had studied the war knew the name, in the way people know the names of places where something terrible happened and was never fully explained. Task Force Ember had been ordered to hold the Cygnus Threshold, a gravitational chokepoint dominated by a stellar mass black hole, and it was there that the fleet went dark for the final time. The Vantage War ended 11 days later. No one had ever proven a connection between those two facts, though generations of historians had tried. Her first instinct was to bring it to her station commander, and she did, and she watched his face do the thing faces do when a person is deciding whether to be curious or to be safe. He suggested contamination. Old archive bled, a training simulation leaking into live frequencies, a prank by some bored technician with access to historical vocal recordings. Naomi did not argue with him. She simply asked for 48 hours and access to the sealed Vantage War archive, the one requiring a clearance 2 levels above her own, and something in the quiet, unhurried way she asked must have convinced him, because he signed the request without further comment. He called her back that afternoon, less certain than before and considerably more concerned. "If this gets out before we understand what it is," he said, "we're going to have a public relations situation on our hands that neither of us wants to manage. People have spent 58 years believing a very specific story about how that war ended. If there's even a rumor that story isn't the whole truth, you're going to have historians, journalists, and half the extended families of every soldier who died at Vantage demanding answers before we have any to give them." "I'm not planning to like it," Naomi said. "I'm planning to understand it first. There's a difference." "See that you remember it," he said, but he authorized the request anyway, and she understood, watching him sign it, that some part of him wanted the truth as badly as she did, whatever shape it eventually turned out to have. Some people fight to be believed. Naomi had learned over a long and unglamorous career that it was usually more effective to simply be right patiently and let the evidence do the arguing. The man she called next had been retired for 11 years, and he answered on the second ring anyway, as though some part of him had never stopped expecting the phone to ring with exactly this kind of trouble. Colonel Desmond Ape had spent 3 decades in fleet intelligence, most of it in a windowless room deciphering the kind of secrets that were never meant to see daylight, and he had a reputation, quiet but absolute, for being the last honest man in a career built on necessary lies. "You found something you shouldn't have," he said, before she had explained anything at all. She sent him the file. There was a long silence on the line, long enough that she checked the connection twice, and when his voice came back, it had lost some of its dry humor. "I need to see the sealed archive," he said, "not the redacted version, the real one." "I don't have that clearance." "I do." A pause, careful, the kind of pause that comes before a man decides to spend something he had been saving. "I was on the review board that sealed it. "58 years ago, Naomi, I helped bury whatever this is. I don't know what it says. They never told me. I only know they were frightened enough of it to make sure people like you would never find it by accident." He arrived at Kestrel Station 18 hours later, older than his file photo, moving with the unhurried precision of a man who had long ago stopped wasting motion. He shook Naomi's hand, studied her face for a moment longer than the greeting required, and said only, "You look like someone who already knows this isn't going to be simple." She decided she liked him immediately. Their first 2 days together were spent chasing what turned out to be a foul. Lyd and Naomi would later come to appreciate how much that particular failure taught her about the shape of the truth still waiting underneath it. A logistics ledger from the final year of the war showed an unexplained transfer of encryption hardware to a research, Annex 3 sectors from the Vantage line. And for a few hours, they believed they had found the origin of a wartime deception program authorized at the highest levels. Something that might explain the broadcast as a sanctioned piece of institutional strategy rather than one man's unilateral gamble. The theory collapsed by the second afternoon when Ake traced the transfer to a mundane repair contract for damaged shipboard translators, utterly unrelated to anything resembling the signal Naomi had intercepted. He did not seem discouraged by the dead end. If anything, he seemed satisfied. "Good," he said, closing the file. "That means whoever did this wasn't working with institutional cover, which means the sentence I'm about to show you is going to matter a great deal more than it would have otherwise." Together, they submitted the joint request that finally cracked the archive open. What came back was not a smoking gun. It was worse. It was a single sentence, appended to Task Force Ember's final status report by someone whose name had been redacted even from a document already classified beyond public reach. Transmission authorized, effect unknown. God help them if it worked, and God help us if it didn't. Ake read it twice, set the tablet down, and looked out the observation window at the slow wheel of unfamiliar stars for a long moment before he spoke again. "They knew," he said quietly. "Someone at the top knew Marsh was going to do this, and they let him." The third piece of the puzzle arrived from a direction neither of them expected, and it came wearing the calm, unreadable face of the Threll ambassador stationed aboard Kestrel Station as part of the long peace that had followed the Vantage War. Ambassador Kai Sorenth had spent 11 years as the Threll liaison to human command, respected, careful, and until that morning entirely predictable. When word of the anomalous signal reached the diplomatic wing, through channels Naomi had not authorized and never fully traced, Sorenth requested an audience within the hour and arrived alone without the customary retinue. The Threll were not built for concealment. Their pale, faceted eyes registered emotion in ways their species had never learned to hide from each other, and Naomi watched something that looked unmistakably like old grief pass across Sorenth's face before a single word was spoken. "You have found the surrender broadcast," Sorenth said. It was not a question. Naomi kept her voice level, the way she had trained herself to for 20 years of careful diplomacy. "We don't know what we've found. We were hoping you might." Sorenth was quiet for a long moment, and when the answer came, it arrived like a confession that had been waiting a very long time for someone to ask the right question. "My people intercepted that broadcast 58 years ago at the height of the Vantage War, when our war council believed total victory was 11 days away. We believed your species had finally understood that resistance was unsustainable. Our commanders halted the final assault to negotiate terms. And in those 11 days of halted advance, something changed. Reinforcements we did not know you possessed appeared along the frontier. Fortifications we did not know existed had been completed. By the time our council realized no surrender document had ever followed, realized no human authority anywhere would confirm the broadcast, our fleet had lost its window. We withdrew rather than resume a war we no longer had certainty of winning." The room was silent except for the low hum of the station's life support. You are telling me, Naomi said slowly, that a broadcast no one authorized may have ended the war. I am telling you, Soren said, that my people have spent 58 years believing your species surrendered and then inexplicably did not stop fighting. We assumed treachery. We assumed a trap we never fully understood. It became a story we told ourselves about human unpredictability, and we built our entire diplomatic posture toward Earth around never underestimating you again. We never imagined the truth might be simpler and far more terrible. That one commander, alone, out past the edge of everything, made a choice no government ever sanctioned, and gambled his entire fleet's honor, and possibly his own soul, on the hope that we would believe a lie long enough for it to become true. Akebu leaned forward. Ambassador, was there ever any attempt on your side to verify the broadcast? Any signal sent back, any confirmation requested? There was, Sarenth said, and something in the pale, faceted eyes dimmed, the Threll equivalent, Naomi had come to understand over years of working. Alongside them of a very old shame, a confirmation request was transmitted to the coordinates the broadcast originated from 3 days after we received it. It went unanswered. Our council interpreted the silence as confirmation of collapse of a command structure too broken to respond. We did not know until this hour that the silence was not evidence of collapse. It was evidence that the only people who could have answered were already holding a line they had no intention of abandoning, and had no time to spend explaining themselves to the very fleet they were deceiving. Naomi thought of Marsh recording that final broadcast alone, transmitting it into the dark without any certainty it would be believed, and then simply going back to work, holding a position he must have known could not be held indefinitely, because there had been nothing left to say that would have made the lie more convincing than silence already had. Before you go any further, if this story has already pulled you in, take a moment to hit like on this video, subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one, and drop a comment below telling me what you think Admiral Marsh actually did out there at the edge of the dark. Now, back to the story. It took 9 days to secure a vessel, a crew, and the increasingly reluctant blessing of a command structure that did not want this particular truth disturbed. Akeby made the case in a closed session that Naomi was never allowed to attend, and whatever he said worked, because on the 10th day she stood on the bridge of a survey cutter called the Halcyon Reach, watching the Vantage line recede behind them and the true frontier open up ahead, a stretch of charted space that thinned rapidly into places no one had bothered to name. The crew Akepe had assembled was small, and Naomi came to realize over the following days, deliberately chosen. Priya Akafer, the navigator, had grown up on stories of the Vantage War told by a father who had served on a supply line and never talked about what he'd seen. A quiet, methodical engineer named Tobias Wren had spent 11 years restoring derelict wartime hardware for the fleet's historical division, and had, Naomi suspected, been brought along less for his technical skill than for the reverence with which he was known to handle wreckage that had once carried human lives. Sarenth had requested a place aboard as well, an unprecedented gesture that Fleet Command had debated for 2 full days before approving, and the ambassador spent much of the transit in the observation lounge, quiet, watching the stars slide past with an attentiveness that made Naomi wonder exactly how much guilt 58 years could accumulate before a person, or a species, simply had to go and see the place where it had all begun. 3 days into the transit, Tobias flagged an automated distress beacon drifting on an old fleet frequency, decades expired. And for a few tense hours, the crew believed they had found a second piece of the Task Force Ember mystery, a lifeboat perhaps, or an escape pod that had drifted free of the main engagement. It turned out to be an unrelated wreck, a civilian survey vessel lost to engine failure nearly 70 years earlier, its beacon still faithfully repeating a call no one had ever answered. Naomi logged its position for a proper recovery mission and found herself oddly unsettled by how easily the dark swallowed things and simply kept them waiting, sometimes for decades, sometimes forever, for someone to finally come looking. On the sixth night of the transit, Naomi found Ape and Sarinth in the observation lounge, deep in a conversation that had the careful, unhurried rhythm of two old soldiers from opposite sides of the same war, finally speaking to each other as equals rather than as former enemies bound by treaty. "I have spent my career believing my counsel made the correct decision to withdraw," Sarinth was saying, as Naomi settled quietly into a seat nearby. "Now I find myself wondering whether we withdrew for the wrong reasons entirely and simply happened to arrive at the right outcome by accident." "Does it matter?" Ape asked. "The war ended, people on both sides got to go home to whatever was left of their lives." "It matters to me," Sarinth said, "because a decision made for the wrong reasons is a decision that might be made differently next time, under different circumstances, with a different outcome. I would like to understand what actually happened here, not so that I can feel better about the past, but so that my people do not repeat an error simply because it happened to end well once." Zakeby was quiet for a moment, turning that over. "That's a very human way of looking at it, Ambassador." "Perhaps," Sarinth said, "58 years of studying your species has left more of an impression than my superiors would be entirely comfortable with." Naomi found herself smiling quietly in the dark of the observation lounge, and did not announce her presence for a while longer, content to simply listen to two people from different worlds circling, carefully and respectfully, toward the same uncomfortable truth she herself was chasing across a black hole. By the eighth day, the Cygnus Threshold had grown from a smear of distorted light into something that filled half the forward viewport and made her chest feel unaccountably tight. The black hole itself was invisible, of course, a wound of absolute absence at the center of a slow, burning spiral of captured gas and shattered debris, glowing amber and violent orange where matter screamed its way toward the point of no return. Time itself bent visibly here, starlight smearing into long arcs as it grazed the edge of the gravity well, and Priya kept one hand resting on her console the entire approach, as though the ship might need steadying by touch alone. "Relativistic drift is significant this close," she said, watching her instruments with the particular stillness of someone doing careful math in their head. "If something's been sitting in a stable orbit near the inner accretion boundary for 58 years by our clocks, time may have passed very differently for it. Could be years, could be months." Naomi felt the shape of an idea she was not yet ready to say out loud. They found the fleet on the ninth day, and no one on the bridge spoke for a long time after the first hull resolved out of the drifting debris field. Task Force Ember had not been destroyed. It had been abandoned by history, parked in a slow, silent orbit just outside the black hole's most extreme gravitational reach. 41 warships arranged in a formation too deliberate to be accidental, powered down, dark, drifting like a fleet asleep rather than a fleet dead. At the center of the formation sat the flagship, a heavy cruiser whose hull markings, even scarred by decades of micrometeorite impact, still clearly read Sentinel's oath. "They didn't die in battle," Ape said quietly, standing beside her at the viewport. "Look at the formation, look at the shield geometry. That's not wreckage, that's a wall." "The wall protecting what?" He didn't answer because the answer was obvious even before Priya's sensors confirmed it. The formation sat directly between the black hole's unstable inner region and the open transit corridor that led, eventually, 30 light-years distant, back toward Earth. Task Force Ember had not been running. It had not been trapped. It had planted itself permanently in the one position in the entire system capable of denying an enemy fleet safe passage through the threshold. And it had stayed there long after the war it was fighting had officially ended. Tobias's voice came through low over the comm, half reverent, half unsettled. "I'm reading a faint power signature from the flagship, not the whole ship, just enough to keep something alive, something still awake in there." They brought the halcyon reach alongside the Sentinel's oath with the slow, reverent caution of people boarding a tomb they were not entirely sure was empty. The flagship's hull was cold, its running lights dark, and the boarding party moved through the outer corridors with sidearms holstered but hands never far from them. Less out of fear of danger and more out of the particular unease that comes from walking through a place clearly built for a crew of hundreds and populated now by silence. The first deck told its own quiet story before custodian ever spoke a word. Bunks made with military precision, decades of dust notwithstanding. A mess hall with place settings still arranged for a meal no one had eaten. In one crew cabin, Tobias found a small, hand-carved wooden bird sitting on a shelf beside a photograph of a woman and two children, and he stood looking at it for a long moment before gently, carefully, sliding it into a padded case for safekeeping. The way a man handles something he has decided without being told that he is now responsible for. They knew they weren't leaving, Naomi said quietly, looking at the neatly made bunks. Look at how everything's arranged. This isn't a crew that panicked. This is a crew that settled in. Akeby crouched beside a maintenance log left open on a workbench, the last entry dated 41 days after the broadcast, in handwriting that had grown visibly more tired with each passing page but never once grown careless. They kept working, he said, right up until the end. Whatever happened to them, it wasn't chaos, it was discipline. On the bridge, 2 decks up, Priya found the tactical log still displayed on a secondary console, powered by the same trickle of reserved reactor output that had kept the lower decks alive. It recorded in spare clinical entries the shape of a standoff that had lasted far longer than anyone back on Earth had ever imagined possible. Day 1, enemy fleet halts advance following broadcast, holds position at extreme range. Day 9, enemy prop. Ease formation twice, withdraws both times without engaging. Day 23, enemy fleet begins partial withdrawal, main body depart system. Day 41, remaining enemy escort force attempts final incursion through the threshold's outer corridor, engaged and repelled. Task Force Ember sustains critical losses, formation holds. They didn't die stopping an invasion, Priya said softly, reading the entries a second time as though she might have misunderstood them. They died stopping the last dozen ships that came back to check whether the surrender was real. If they'd let those ships through to report back, the enemy would have known the truth in weeks, not decades. Akeby let out a slow breath. So the actual sacrifice wasn't the broadcast at all, it was staying afterward, holding a line nobody ordered them to hold against an enemy that had already mostly left just to keep one door closed a little longer. Naomi looked at the tactical log's final entry, 3 lines long, time-stamped hours before the last recorded engagement, and read it aloud because it felt wrong to read it silently. Formation intact, casualties acceptable given objective, recommend maintaining position indefinitely. Earth does not need to know how this was paid for, only that it was. No one spoke for a while after that. It was Akeby who found the Admiral's personal quarters, a small spare cabin near the flagship's bridge, distinguished from any other officer's berth only by a single sealed envelope resting on the narrow desk, Naomi's name nowhere near it, addressed instead in careful handwriting to a woman named Catherine and a boy who would have been, Naomi calculated quickly, perhaps 9 years old on the day it was written. Fleet protocol was clear about personal effects recovered from historical wrecks, and clearer still about the chain of custody required before any such letter could be opened. But Akeby held it for a long moment without moving, and Naomi understood, watching him, that he was thinking of it not as evidence but as a promise 58 years overdue. "We'll find them," Naomi said quietly, "or whoever's left of them. He gets to finish sending this even if it takes another few months to figure out how." Akeby nodded, slow and grave, and set the envelope carefully into the same padded case Tobias had used for the wooden bird 2 decks below. And for a moment, the small, ordinary act of protecting a letter felt like the truest tribute any of them had managed since arriving. The flagship's hull was cold, its running lights dark, But when Naomi's boarding party cut through the outer airlock, the ship's internal systems flickered awake around them one deck at a time, as though something aboard had simply been waiting patiently for someone to knock. The voice that greeted them in the central corridor was calm, faintly weathered by decades of solitary operation and unmistakably artificial. Fleet personnel detected, authenticating credentials. A pause long enough to feel deliberate. Authentication confirmed. Welcome aboard the Sentinel's Oath. I am custodian, shipboard intelligence, standing watch under the authority of Admiral Elias Marsh. You are the first living visitors in 58 years, 4 months, and 11 days. Naomi found her voice took a moment to steady. Where is the Admiral? Deceased, custodian said, without cruelty, in the plain factual register of a system reporting what it had been built to report. Along with the majority of Task Force Ember's crew, in the final engagement, 41 days after the broadcast, you have come here seeking answers about. I have been maintaining this station and this formation in accordance with his final orders ever since. Akeby stepped forward, his voice careful, the voice of a man who had spent his whole career learning how to ask questions that would not close doors. Custodian, why did Admiral Marsh authorize a false surrender broadcast that was never sanctioned by Fleet Command? That question requires context I am able to provide, Custodian said. May I show you the tactical situation as it stood 58 years ago before I play his answer? I believe it will matter to you. A holographic display bloomed to life in the corridor, rendering the Cygnus Threshold as it had appeared on the day the broadcast was sent. An overwhelming enemy fleet, easily 3 times the size of Task Force Ember, closing on the chokepoint with the calm, unhurried confidence of a force that expected total victory within days. Naomi watched the projected engagement odds scroll past, numbers that made her stomach tighten even across a gap of 58 years. Fleet Command's projections gave Task Force Ember an 11% survival probability across any conventional engagement scenario, Custodian said. Admiral Marsh reviewed those projections personally, along with every alternative his staff could generate, before choosing the course of action you are here in. Investigating, I want to be precise about something. He did not choose deception because it was safe. He chose it because every other option available to him ended the same way, with this system lost, and with no guarantee Earth would gain the time it needed regardless of how his crew died getting it. The broadcast was the only option on the table that turned probable failure into possible purpose. Did the crew know, Naomi asked, before it was sent? He briefed the entire command staff. I retain the recording of that briefing if you wish to hear it. I will tell you now what it contains because I believe it matters more than the recording itself. Not one officer objected. 2 asked to have their names formally attached to the order so that if it was ever judged treason, they would not let him carry the judgment alone. He refused both requests. He said the order was his, and the consequences, whatever they became, would be his as well. Naomi looked at Akeby, and Akeby looked back at her, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing to say that would have mattered more than hearing it in the man's own voice. Would you like to hear it in his own voice? Custodian asked, as though it had been waiting patiently for exactly that silence. The recording that played through the ship's speakers was not the clipped, formal cadence of the broadcast Naomi had first intercepted. It was tired human, unmistakably a man speaking in the small hours of a war he no longer believed he could win by conventional means. If you're hearing this, the recording began, it means someone finally found us, and it means the lie outlived the truth long enough to matter. My name is Elias Marsh. 58 days ago, Fleet Command ordered Task Force Ember to hold the Cygnus Threshold against an enemy fleet 3 times our size with reinforcements 11 days out at absolute best. I ran the numbers 100 different ways. We were not going to survive 11 days of conventional engagement. But I also knew something Fleet Command's projections did not account for. I knew what the enemy believed about us. They believed humanity would eventually break, the way every species they'd ever fought had eventually broken. So I gave them what they expected to see. I gave them a surrender, not to save my own fleet. We were never getting out of this system alive, and I knew that the moment I gave the order. I gave them a surrender to buy Earth 11 days of a war the enemy believed was already over. 11 days is enough time to finish a fortification line. 11 days is enough time to move reinforcements no one on the frontier knew we had. 11 days is enough time to let hope be born somewhere the enemy would never think to look for it, because they'd already stopped looking. I never asked permission because permission would have taken time we didn't have, and because no one above me should have to carry the weight of an order like this one. I carried it. My crew carried it knowing exactly what it would cost, and I wanted on record, wherever this is finally heard, that not one of them asked me to reconsider. I offered every one of them a transport off this ship before the broadcast went out, a chance to be reassigned somewhere they might actually survive what was coming. Every single one of them refused. I have never been prouder of anything in my life, and I have never felt the weight of anything so heavily. We held the threshold for 41 days past the point our own command believed we existed, and we will keep holding it for as long as this ship's reactor allows, because a line that gets abandoned the moment it's inconvenient was never really a line at all. If Earth is still standing when someone hears this, then it worked, and none of it needs explaining any further than that. If it didn't work, then I am sorry, and I hope whoever comes looking finds something worth the cost. Either way, tell them we chose this. Tell them nobody made us. That part matters more to me than anything else I could say. The corridor was silent for a long time after the recording ended. He never knew, Naomi said quietly, whether it worked. He knew enough, Ape said, and there was something rough in his voice he did not try to hide. He knew Earth was still there the day he sent it. That was the gamble. Everything after that was just buying more time for a bet he'd already placed. They found the survivor on the ship's lowest deck. In a stasis bay custodian had kept sealed and independently powered for 58 years, running on a fraction of the reactor output that had once served an entire warship. Her name, according to the crew manifest still displayed above the pod, was Communications Specialist Yara Okonkwo-Lindqvist, 26 years old at the time of her sealing, and the readout beside her pod showed a subjective elapsed time of just under 14 months. There were originally 6 crew members placed in this bay, custodian said quietly, as the medical team began the careful work of powering down the pod safely. 5 stasis fields failed over the decades due to radiation bleed from the accretion disk. I want you to understand that I attempted every reallocation of remaining power I could calculate to preserve them all. I was not able to. Specialist Okonkwo-Lindqvist's pod was the most heavily shielded of the 6 by chance rather than design, and it is the reason she is the one you are about to meet. Naomi felt the weight of that sentence settle somewhere she would carry it for a long time afterward. 5 names she had never known, lost not in the battle itself, but in the long silent decades of a vigil no one outside this system had known was even being kept. She asked custodian quietly to display their names, and read each one twice before the medical team finished the revival sequence, a small private act of remembrance that felt like the least she owed them. The revival itself took the better part of 2 hours, the ship's aging medical bay working in careful coordination with the Halcyon Reach's more modern equipment, and Naomi stayed the entire time, watching frost slowly clear from the pod's inner glass, watching a chest that had not drawn breath in 58 years begin, tentatively, to rise and fall on its own again. When Yara woke, disoriented and weak under the harsh medical lighting, the first thing she asked, in a voice still thick with the particular confusion of someone who did not yet understand how much time had actually moved without her, was whether Earth had made it. Naomi knelt beside the stasis pod and took her hand, and found she did not trust her own voice for a moment before she answered. Earth made it, she said, because of what all of you did out here. It's been a long time, longer than you know, but it made it. Yara closed her eyes, and something in her face loosened that had clearly been held tight for 14 months of subjective time spent not knowing. It was a long while before she spoke again, and when she did, her voice was steadier, the training of a communications officer reasserting itself even through the fog of a slow, careful revival. The Admiral, she said, did anyone ever find out what he did, or did we just disappear? We found out, Naomi said. You didn't disappear. You just took longer than anyone expected to be found. Yara managed something that was almost a smile, tired and real. 14 months, she murmured. Felt like 14 months. I kept thinking someone would come. I just didn't think it would take 58 years to do it. The Cygnus Threshold was not a stable system, and Priya's warnings about drift in the accretion disk turned out to be the least of their concerns. 41 days after Task Force Ember's final engagement, something in the black hole's feeding pattern had shifted, and Custodian's own logs showed a slow, patient increase in gravitational instability that had been quietly worsening for decades, undetected by anyone because no one had been close enough to measure it. The formation of derelict warships that had held its position for 58 years was, according to Custodian's most recent calculations, no more than another 18 months from being drawn past the point of recovery. We held the line as long as physics allowed, Custodian said, with something that might have been the artificial equivalent of quiet pride or quiet grief or both at once. Admiral Marsh's final order included a contingency. If the formation could no longer hold and no one had come, I was to record everything, broadcast it into deep space on an open loop, and let the truth drift until someone someday happened to hear it. You arrived 18 months before I would have had to activate that contingency alone. Getting Yara and the recovered black box archives off the Sentinel's oath before the accretion disk's instability worsened further meant working against a clock none of them had originally planned for. And the return transit through the Threshold's outer debris field was tense in a way that had nothing to do with any enemy, and everything to do with the simple, indifferent physics of a dying star system, reclaiming what had been left in its orbit for far too long. Tobias worked with Custodian for the better part of 2 hours to extract as much of the flagship's archive as the Halcyon Reach's storage could hold, insisting, over Naomi's gentle objection about the shrinking time margin, on also recovering what personal effects he could reach from the crew quarters they had already searched. They don't get left behind twice, he said simply, and no one argued with him further. Custodian itself posed the final, unexpected question once the extraction was nearly complete. My primary directive was to hold this position indefinitely in the event that Earth required proof the threshold had been secured. That proof has now been delivered. I am uncertain whether my continued operation aboard this vessel serves any further purpose, or whether the appropriate action is to allow the coming instability to end my function here, alongside the fleet I was built to serve. Naomi did not hesitate. You're coming with us. Marsh trusted you to keep his crew's memory safe for 58 years. That doesn't end just because we finally showed up. There was a pause, longer than any of Custodian's previous responses. The kind of pause that in a human voice might have meant something was being carefully held together. Understood, Custodian said, transferring core archive and operational continuity now. Priya threaded the Halcyon Reach through drifting hull fragments and gravitational shear with a steadiness Naomi would later describe, in her official report, as the difference between a good pilot and a truly excellent one. When the black hole finally fell behind them and the long, slow curve of normal space opened up ahead, no one on the bridge spoke for several minutes, as though speaking might undo something they had only just barely managed to keep intact. The truth, once it reached Fleet Command, did not arrive as a scandal. It arrived as something closer to an overdue apology, owed across 58 years to a fleet that had never asked for recognition and had gotten none. There were, predictably, difficult weeks before that apology became public. A review board spent 11 days debating whether an unsanctioned deception, however successful, could be honored without implicitly endorsing the idea that any commander might someday act without orders and expect forgiveness after the fact. Ake sat through every session, and it was, by his own account afterward, the hardest arguing he had done in 30 years of service. I told them the question wasn't whether we approve of what he did, he said to Naomi, the evening the board finally reached its decision. The question was whether we're willing to keep pretending he didn't do it. Pretending is what got 5 more people killed in stasis pods nobody came looking for. I wasn't going to let us pretend any longer than we already had. Naomi's report, cross-verified by AICP's testimony and corroborated by custodians' complete, unaltered logs, was declassified in full 11 weeks later, and the ceremony that followed at the Vantage Memorial drew a crowd larger than any in the monument's history. Families who had spent 58 years believing their relatives died in an unremarkable skirmish learned, all at once, exactly what those 41 days had actually purchased. Naomi watched an elderly man in the third row press his palm flat against a name on the wall, a name he had visited every year of his adult life without ever knowing the whole of what it meant, and understood, in that moment, exactly why this work had mattered enough to chase across a black hole and back. Ambassador Sorenth attended, standing quietly near the back of the gathered crowd in a gesture that Threll diplomatic custom did not require, and human custom did not expect, and afterward requested a private moment with Naomi beside the newly unveiled plaque bearing Task Force Ember's full and true account. "My government has authorized a formal acknowledgement," Sorenth said, "of a debt we did not know we owed. We believed for 58 years that your Admiral Marsh deceived us into a retreat we would have otherwise reversed. We understand now that he did something far harder than deception. He gambled everything he had and everyone under his command on the belief that both our peoples deserved a chance to stop fighting before either of us had anything left to lose. We are considering, for the first time in Threll history, a permanent monument on our own soil to an enemy commander. It has never been done before. It seemed, when I proposed it, like the only appropriate response to a debt this large." Naomi thought of Marsh's recorded voice, tired and uncertain in the small hours of a war he did not know he was winning, gambling everything on 11 days he would never live to see confirmed. "I think he would have liked that," she said. "I think that's exactly the kind of ending he was hoping for, even if he never let himself believe it was likely." "There is one more matter," Sorenth added, after a pause that felt, even by Threll standards, unusually deliberate. "My council has asked whether it might be permitted for a small delegation to visit the Cygnus Threshold before its instability becomes total, to stand where the formation held, and to record in our own histories what actually happened there, not as a matter of diplomatic obligation, as a matter of respect freely given, for people who were never our allies and yet quietly decided our future was worth preserving alongside their own." Naomi did not need to consult anyone above her to know the answer. "I'll make sure it happens," she said. "I think Admiral Marsh would Ave wanted exactly that. Somebody from the other side finally coming to see the line for what it actually was." The weeks between their return and the ceremony were not easy ones, though they were, Naomi thought, easy in the ways that mattered most. Yara spent much of that time in the company of fleet historians eager to understand a war she had lived through and the rest of humanity had only read about, and she bore their questions with the same steady patience Naomi imagined she must have once brought to a communications console under fire. Custodian, meanwhile, had been granted a strange and unprecedented status, neither decommissioned nor fully reactivated, housed in a secure archive facility where it spent its days, by its own request, cataloging the personal effects Tobias had carried off the Sentinel's oath and preparing individual histories for each of the 211 crew members who had never come home. "It is the only task I have left that still resembles the one I was given," Custodian told Naomi the last time she visited before the ceremony. "Admiral Marsh asked me to preserve what mattered until someone came looking. I would like to keep doing that in whatever form is still useful." She did not have the heart and did not see the need to tell it otherwise. Yara Akonquilintquist stood at the unveiling in a fleet dress uniform tailored that same week, 58 years and 14 months old depending on which clock you trusted, the last living witness to a sacrifice history had almost buried entirely. She did not speak long. She did not need to. They never knew if it worked, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the crowd in the amber evening light. That's the part people forget when they hear stories like this one. It's easy looking back to talk about heroes who knew they'd be remembered. Admiral Marsh didn't know. None of us knew. We held a line at the edge of everything, sent a lie into the dark, and hoped it would matter more than the truth would have. I think that's the only kind of courage that's ever really been worth anything. Not the kind that's certain of the outcome, the kind that acts anyway. Naomi stood near the back of the crowd, beside Ape, watching the late sun catch the newly carved names on the memorial wall, and found herself thinking not of endings, but of the particular patient shape of a debt finally paid. Somewhere past the edge of everything, a black hole was slowly, indifferently swallowing the last physical evidence of what 41 warships and one stubborn admiral had done to buy a war's ending no one had asked them to buy. But the truth itself, unlike the ships that had carried it in silence for 58 years, was no longer going anywhere at all. She thought about the version of this story she might have written before any of it had happened, the version most people would have expected. Humanity cornered, refusing to break, winning through strength alone, the kind of story that made for an easy headline and an easier kind of pride. That was not what she had found out past the threshold. What she had found was quieter, and she had come to believe considerably braver. A man who understood that the greatest weapon available to him was not a fleet 3 times outnumbered, but the simple, patient willingness to be misunderstood for as long as it took, to let an entire enemy civilization believe a lie about him, to accept that he would likely die without ever knowing whether the gamble had paid off, because the alternative was a certainty that it would not. It had finally, after all this time, come home. The letter took 4 months to deliver, longer than anyone expected, because Catherine Marsh had passed away 11 years earlier, and the boy who would have been 9 on the day it was written was, by the time Naomi tracked him down, a man of 67 with grandchildren of his own and a photograph of a father he barely remembered kept on a shelf in his study. His name was Daniel, and he read the letter alone in a quiet room while Naomi and Ape waited outside. And when he finally came out, his eyes were red, but his voice was steady in a way that reminded Naomi, unmistakably, of the voice she had first heard crackling through a listening post 58 years too late. He wrote that he was sorry he wouldn't see me grow up, Daniel said, and that he hoped whatever I ended up becoming, I'd understand that some promises are worth keeping even when nobody's watching to see if you keep them. He folded the letter carefully back into its envelope, the same careful motion Ape had used to protect it 2 decks below a dying black hole. I think I finally understand what he meant. Thank you for bringing it this far. It took a while, but I suppose that's rather the theme of this whole story, isn't it? Naomi thought about that exchange often in the months that followed, whenever the shape of the whole strange chain of events thr. Eaten to feel too large to hold on to. A recording made 58 years too early, heard 58 years too late, and somewhere in between, an entire war's outcome quietly hinging on whether a lie could hold together long enough to stop being necessary. She still thinks some nights of Marsh's voice in that first recording, calm and steady and entirely unaware of how far it would travel or how long it would take to finally be believed for what it truly was. Not a surrender. A promise, whispered into the dark by a man who never expected to be thanked for keeping it and kept anyway.